When people speak of the Celts, they are often reaching for something both familiar and elusive, a word that seems to gather together a wide world of ancient peoples without ever fully fixing them in place. In the broadest sense, the term refers to communities spread across large parts of Europe in the first millennium BCE and into the Roman era, from the Atlantic fringes of the Iberian Peninsula to Central Europe, and later to the British Isles and Ireland. Yet the Celts were never one single nation in the modern sense, and likely never thought of themselves that way. They were many tribes, kingdoms, and local cultures, connected by language, style, trade, and certain shared ways of life, but separated by geography, politics, and constant change. The word itself comes to us through Greek and Roman writers, who applied names like Celt and Celti to groups they encountered or heard about. So even at the beginning, the subject is partly ancient reality and partly later interpretation, a reminder that history often arrives to us through layers of naming. What makes the Celts especially interesting is that their world was not centered on stone monuments alone, but on movement, craftsmanship, and social bonds. Their societies were often organized around clans and tribal groups, with power held by local elites, warrior leaders, and in some cases religious specialists. They lived in a landscape of forests, rivers, marshes, and hills, places that shaped travel and settlement just as much as politics did. Many Celtic communities built fortified hilltops, now called hill forts, where people could gather, trade, defend themselves, and display status. These places were not always permanent war camps as older stories once imagined. Often they were centers of local life, with houses, workshops, animals, and storage spaces, all set within earthworks and timber defenses. If one tries to imagine them in the quiet before dawn, there would have been smoke from hearths, the smell of damp soil, the sound of cattle, and the low activity of a settlement waking slowly behind its walls. One of the clearest traces of the Celts is language. Celtic languages belong to the larger Indo-European family, and though the old continental languages are now mostly lost, their descendants survived in the British Isles and remain alive today in forms such as Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Breton, and Cornish. These languages are not simply relics trapped in the past. They are living systems that carry echoes of ancient speech, poetry, and memory. Scholars study them carefully because they offer clues about migration, contact, and identity, but the linguistic picture is not always simple. The old Celtic world was not linguistically uniform, and different regions likely spoke different tongues and dialects, some of which disappeared without being recorded in detail. What survives is a fragmentary chorus, preserved in inscriptions, later manuscripts, and the endurance of oral tradition. In a way, the languages themselves are one of the gentlest forms of archaeology because they keep sounding across centuries, carrying old rhythms into new mouths. Archaeology shows that Celtic material culture could be remarkably refined. One of the best-known archaeological traditions associated with the Celts is the Hallstatt culture, followed by Lartene, both named after modern sites where characteristic objects were first identified. These cultures are linked to impressive metalwork, especially in bronze, iron, gold, and enamel. Celtic craftsmen produced swords, shields, brooches, cauldrons, horse gear, and ceremonial items decorated with curving lines, plant forms, and intricate patterns that seem almost to move as the eye follows them. Their art often feels alive, full of spirals, triskells, and interlacing shapes, suggesting motion, transformation, and perhaps symbolic ideas we can only partly recover. Such objects were not merely decorative. They communicated wealth, rank, religious meaning, and local identity. A finely made brooch or sword could announce a person's status before they spoke a single word. It is easy to imagine these surfaces catching torchlight in a hall at night, or reflecting the pale sun over a hillside settlement. The Celts were also deeply connected to iron, and that connection helped shape their historical reputation. Iron tools and weapons became more widespread in Celtic Europe during the first millennium BCE, allowing for stronger ploughs, better cutting implements, and more durable arms. This did not mean constant war, though warfare certainly mattered. More reliable tools would have helped clear land, work fields, manage forests, and support larger populations in some regions. The image of the Celtic warrior with spear and sword has been emphasized by ancient writers and later Romantic traditions, but daily life would have included much ordinary labor as well. Tending animals, grinding grain, weaving cloth, repairing fences, and preparing food for family and community. The warrior elite may have stood out most dramatically to outsiders, especially to Greek and Roman observers who often described them as brave, dangerous, or flamboyant. Yet beneath such descriptions was a society held together by agriculture and craft, by the practical rhythms of survival as much as by martial display. Religion in the Celtic world is another area where certainty becomes delicate. The Celts did not leave behind a single sacred book, and so much of what is known comes from archaeology, later medieval texts, and outside testimony from Roman authors. It is likely that their religious life centered on sacred places in nature, ritual deposits, seasonal observances, offerings, and specialized religious figures, often called druids in the classical sources. Druids appear as priests, judges, teachers, and keepers of tradition, though much about them remains uncertain. Ancient writers sometimes portrayed them with fascination, fear, or political bias, so their accounts must be handled carefully. Still, there is strong evidence that religious practice mattered deeply in Celtic societies. Water was especially important, with many sites near springs, wells, rivers, and marshes yielding votive offerings. In some places, weapons, jewelry, and even human remains were deposited in watery settings, perhaps as gifts to deities or spirits. The sacred landscape was not always set apart from daily life. It was often woven into it, as if the earth itself participated in the moral and ritual order of the community. And then there is the long and complicated question of whether the Celts were one people or many. Modern imagination sometimes treats the Celts as a single ethnic bloc, but ancient Europe was much more fluid than that. Identity in the ancient world could depend on language, kinship, local allegiance, dress, custom, or political alliance, and these things could change over time. Some groups that modern scholarship calls Celtic may have been linked mainly by language and art rather than by a unified sense of shared descent. Others may have mixed freely with neighboring peoples through marriage, trade, and conflict. Roman conquest further complicated the picture because some Celtic regions were absorbed into the empire, while others remained beyond direct control. Over time, local identities shifted and new blends emerged. This is one reason the study of the Celts is so absorbing. It resists neat boundaries. The ancient world was full of contact zones, where peoples met, borrowed, adapted, and transformed one another quietly, generation by generation. Trade helped carry those transformations along. Celtic communities were not isolated hillfolk living at the edge of civilization, despite older stereotypes. They exchanged goods with Greeks, Etruscans, Phoenicians, Romans, and neighboring European groups. Amber, salt, metal, cloth, wine, slaves, pottery, and luxury objects all moved through these networks in different periods. Imported goods could appear in elite burials or feast sites, suggesting that local leaders used them to signal prestige and connection to the wider world. At the same time, Celtic products also travelled outward, carrying their own styles into distant markets. These exchange networks were not always peaceful, of course, but trade and conflict often existed side by side. A river that served as a route for merchants might also carry raiders, messengers, or armies. The result was a landscape in motion, where local cultures developed within a broad web of contact stretching far beyond any single valley or tribe. Celtic burials offer another glimpse into their societies, though as always the evidence is uneven. Some grave were richly furnished with weapons, ornaments, drinking vessels, and items associated with status. Others were far simpler. Burial customs varied widely by region and time, which suggests that there was no single Celtic funerary practice. In some cases, cremation was common; in others, inhumation was preferred. Grave goods can hint at beliefs about the afterlife, social rank, or the relationship between the living and the dead, but they do not speak clearly on their own. Even so, the care invested in some burials suggests that memory and identity mattered deeply. A person might be remembered through the objects placed around them, through the mound or marker built above them, or through the lineage that carried their name forward. Ancient burial grounds can feel still and hushed today, but they once stood in places where the living returned, perhaps to mourn, to honor, and to reinforce the ties between family, land, and ancestry. The Celtic world also had a strong oral dimension. Much of what they knew, valued, and preserved may have lived first in spoken form. Stories, genealogies, legal traditions, praise poetry, ritual speech, and practical knowledge passed from person to person. Oral cultures are often underestimated because they leave fewer durable traces than written ones, but that does not make them less sophisticated. Memory in such societies can be highly organized and socially powerful. A skilled storyteller or poet might preserve political history, heroic tales, and the names of ancestors with remarkable precision. Later Irish and Welsh literature, though written down in medieval times, likely preserves echoes of much older oral traditions. The famous cycles of heroes, kings, and battles may not be exact records of prehistoric events, but they do preserve an older cultural atmosphere, one shaped by honor, generosity, rivalry, and the tension between human ambition and fate. If these stories were once recited aloud in halls, they would have unfolded slowly, in the company of firelight and silence, with listeners attentive to each familiar phrase. Finally, it is worth remembering that the Celts were not frozen in time. Their world. When people speak of the Celts, they are often speaking about a world that was never neatly bounded, and that is part of what makes it so fascinating. The term itself comes to us through ancient writers, not from a single Celtic kingdom or a unified Celtic people. Greek and Roman authors used words like Celt and Celti to describe different groups they encountered or heard about, sometimes near the Alps, sometimes farther west, and sometimes in ways that seem broad or imprecise by modern standards. So even at the beginning of the story, there is a soft uncertainty in the record. We are looking through the language of outsiders, through names recorded in scrolls and inscriptions, and through the quiet evidence left in grave, farms, metalwork, and hill forts. That means the Celts are not a simple chapter in history, but a wide and shifting landscape of communities linked by overlapping customs, trade, art styles, and languages that changed from place to place. In the early morning light of scholarship, the world of the Celts looks less like a single nation and more like a cluster of related societies spread across Europe, each with its own local rhythms. This is one reason why the Celtic languages are so important. Long after many ancient peoples disappeared from the written record, their languages left living traces. Today, the surviving Celtic languages include Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Breton, Cornish, and Manx, each one shaped by centuries of change, migration, and survival under pressure from larger political powers. Linguists group them into branches, usually distinguishing between Gaelic and Brittonic languages, and from that classification alone, we can glimpse ancient separation and long development. These languages preserve old grammatical structures and familiar sounds, yet they also carry the marks of medieval monasteries, ocean travel, royal courts, and everyday speech in villages and harbours. Their survival is not accidental. It reflects the stubborn continuity of communities that kept speaking, teaching, singing, and remembering even when political power shifted around them. In the hush of a sleeping room, It is worth imagining how a language can survive in the mouth of a grandmother, in a prayer, in a lullaby, in the notes of a bard, and then quietly cross centuries into the present. Archaeology gives us another way into the Celtic world, especially through the Hallstatt and Latin cultures, which are often used as markers for early Celtic Europe. Hallstatt, named after a site in Austria, is associated with the early Iron Age, while Latin, named after a site in Switzerland, is linked with the later Iron Age and is famous for its elegant, swirling art. These labels are useful, though they are also modern scholarly tools rather than names the people themselves would necessarily have used. Within these cultures, we find evidence of iron weapons, prestige goods, complex burial customs, and networks of exchange stretching across rivers and mountain passes. The objects themselves can be strangely intimate. A brooch bent by time, a sword laid beside a body, a cauldron made for feasting, a wagon fitting shaped by a craftsman's hands. Such finds suggest societies where rank mattered, where display mattered, and where artistry could turn metal into something almost alive with movement. The curves and spirals of Latin design seem to drift and unfurl, like vines seen through mist, inviting the eye to rest and follow their patterns without hurry. The Celts were also famous in the eyes of ancient writers for their warriors, yet warfare was only one part of their societies. Greek and Roman accounts often emphasize their fierceness, their bold charges, their noisy battle cries, and their long swords, perhaps because dramatic descriptions made for memorable history, and perhaps because enemies tend to notice what frightens them most. But behind those accounts stood real social structures. Many Celtic groups were organized around kinship, clientage, and local elites. Some leaders held power through generosity, distribution of food and treasure, and the ability to gather followers. Warbands could form around such figures, yet these were not merely bands of violence, they were also political and social networks. Feasting, gift-giving, and reputation were deeply important. A chieftain's hall could be a place of diplomacy as well as display, where stories were told, alliances renewed, and metal cups passed from hand to hand in the warmth of firelight. In this sense, the warrior image is only one thread in a much larger tapestry, and the sounds of clashing arms should not drown out the quieter work of sustaining a community. Something else that often appears in the study of the Celts is their relationship with the natural world, especially with rivers, springs, groves, and other places that seem to have held sacred meaning. We should be careful here because the evidence is uneven. Much of what we know comes from archaeology, later medieval literature, and Roman-era testimony, each with its own limitations. Still, many Celtic-speaking societies appear to have attached religious importance to particular landscapes. Offerings have been found in watery places, and some deities are closely tied to specific features of land and water. Springs may have been viewed as thresholds between worlds, and rivers as living boundaries rather than mere geography. There is something deeply human in this. A place where water rises from the earth, clear and cold, can feel timeless and watchful. A grove of trees, thick with leaf shadow, can seem to hold its own silence. For the Celts, as far as we can tell, sacredness was often woven into the land itself, not separated from it. The world was not simply occupied, it was inhabited by powers, presences, and memory. The priests and ritual specialists associated with the Celtic world are often known as Druids, though here too the evidence is delicate and filtered through outsiders. Roman authors describe Druids as judges, teachers, and religious authorities, and they sometimes portrayed them as wise custodians of tradition. Much later, medieval and modern imagination would turn Druids into figures of mystery, draped in white robes beneath ancient oaks. The historical reality is likely more complex. Druidic roles probably varied by region and period, and not every Celtic society may have had the same institution. Yet it is clear that learning mattered. The Druids were said to preserve legal knowledge, genealogies, and sacred traditions, and some accounts mention extended training, sometimes lasting years. Much of this knowledge may have been transmitted orally, which means it left only faint traces for historians to follow. Oral tradition can be powerful precisely because it lives in performance, in repetition, in memory sharpened by use. In a quiet way, that gives the Druidic world a deeply atmospheric quality, wisdom carried in the voice, in the pause between phrases, in words recited at the right moment and remembered by those who heard them. As Celtic societies changed, their towns and settlements changed too. Early communities often lived in farmsteads, villages, and fortified hilltops, but in some regions there were also larger centres, sometimes called oppida by Roman writers. These were not cities in the later Roman sense, but they could be hubs of craft production, trade, and political gathering. Earthworks, wooden defences, gates, and internal roads suggest organised space, while workshops point to metalworking, pottery, and exchange. One can imagine the smell of smoke, livestock, and iron in such places, the sound of hammers on anvils, the movement of people carrying grain, hides, and tools. Trade linked Celtic communities with the Mediterranean world, bringing wine, ceramics, ornaments, and new ideas alongside local goods. Even where we lack detailed records, the material evidence tells us that these people were not isolated. They lived in a connected Europe, one in which rivers and coastlines served as pathways, and distant regions could be joined by merchant interests, diplomatic ties, and the slow circulation of prestige objects. Celtic art, perhaps more than any single feature, reveals how imaginative and distinctive these cultures could be. The art is often dynamic rather than static, favouring spirals, trumpet shapes, knots, interlace, animal forms, and patterns that seem to shift as the eye moves. Unlike more formal styles that emphasize symmetry and restraint, Celtic decorative art can feel as if it is growing, curling, and breathing. It appears on shields, torques, helmets, mirror backs, brooches, coins, and stone carvings, and later it would continue into the illuminated manuscripts of medieval Ireland and Britain. Scholars have long admired the technical skill involved. Working in bronze, gold, enamel, and iron, Celtic artisans achieved effects that were both precise and fluid. The craftsmanship suggests patient hands and trained eyes, perhaps in workshops where designs were copied, adapted, and refined over generations. There is comfort in that continuity. A pattern repeated carefully on metal can outlast its maker by centuries, and the same visual language can travel from object to object like a quiet melody remembered in different rooms. Religious life in the Celtic world was not confined to temples in the later classical sense. Sanctuaries could be open-air places, enclosed by ditches or fences, or located beside springs, rivers, and marshes. Offerings were often deposited in ways that suggest communication with divine powers rather than simple storage. Weapons may have been deliberately damaged before being placed in water or earth. Feasts may have accompanied rituals. Some sites show evidence of repeated use over long periods, indicating that sacred places were remembered and returned to. The gods themselves are harder to reconstruct because names and attributes vary widely across regions. Some deities were later equated with Roman gods through the process known as interpretatio Romana, which can be helpful but also distorting. Still, we can sense a religious world rich in local variation, where divinity might be attached to rivers, healing, fertility, protection, or sovereignty. It was a world that did not demand loud uniformity. Instead, it seems to have welcomed a layered sacred geography, where each place could have its own memory and its own unseen presence. Then, as Rome expanded, Celtic societies entered a period of profound change. Conquest did not happen everywhere at once, and in some places Roman influence came through trade, alliance, or gradual political pressure before full military takeover. In Gaul, in many parts of the Celtic world, the home was more than shelter. It was the centre of family life, craft, and memory. A roundhouse with a thatched roof and woven walls could hold the warmth of people, animals, food, and tools all under one smoky interior. The fire often burned in the middle of the room, sending its scent through the rafters and blackening the beams above. Archaeologists have found traces of these houses in earthwork rings and post holes, though the exact appearance varied from region to region. Some had simple mud walls, while others were built with timber frames and wattle woven between them. In wet climates, a raised platform or packed earth floor kept sleeping places and stored grain dry. The very shape of the house may have carried symbolic meaning as well, since round forms were common in earlier European traditions. Inside, life would have been practical and close, with weaving, cooking, tool repair, and quiet storytelling happening in the same small space. It is easy to imagine the low light of a hearth fire flickering across baskets, pottery, and hanging herbs, while rain tapped softly at the roof. As the evenings deepened, many Celtic communities would have known the rhythm of seasonal feasting. These gatherings were not just moments of eating, but occasions for social order, gift exchange, and public memory. Meat, grain, dairy, ale, and preserved fruits might all appear depending on the landscape and the time of year. Feasts could mark marriages, funerals, victories, harvests, or the arrival of respected guests. In the cooler parts of the year, the smell of roasting meat and simmering broth would have spread through a hall or settlement, carrying a sense of comfort and abundance. The elite certainly feasted more lavishly, but communal eating was a wider cultural pattern too. Some classical writers described Celtic hospitality as generous, though their accounts must be read carefully, because outsiders often saw difference before they saw nuance. What seems clear is that sharing food helped bind communities together. Around a fire, a feast could become a place where news was heard, alliances were renewed, and old stories were repeated so often that they settled into collective memory like embers under ash. Another important part of Celtic life was the role of skilled craft workers. Metalworkers, potters, weavers, leatherworkers, and woodcarvers shaped the everyday world with patient hands. Among them, smiths often held a special reputation, because iron and bronze could be transformed into weapons, tools, jewelry, and ceremonial objects. The glow of a furnace, the ringing of hammer on anvil, and the smell of hot metal would have filled a workshop with a kind of intense, focused atmosphere. Some objects were practical, made for farming, hunting, or riding, while others were elaborately decorated with curving designs, animal forms, or enamel inlays. The Latin artistic style, associated with many Iron Age Celtic communities, is especially known for flowing patterns that seem to move like vines or water. Scholars still debate how much of this art was local, how much was shared across wider networks, and how much reflected contact with the Mediterranean world. Still, the craftsmanship itself is unmistakable. The Celtic imagination was often expressed not in long written texts, but in objects that combined usefulness with beauty, so that even a brooch or cauldron could carry elegance into ordinary life. Trade tied many Celtic regions together and also connected them to distant worlds. Amber, salt, livestock, slaves, metal, cloth, and fine goods moved along rivers, coasts, roads, and caravan routes. A person living in a settlement far from the sea might still encounter Mediterranean wine jars, Roman glass, or imported coins, depending on the period and the region. Such objects suggest that the Celts were not isolated woodland people, as older stereotypes sometimes implied, but participants in broad and changing exchange networks. River crossings and marketplaces would have been especially important because they allowed communities to gather without necessarily merging into one political body. Traders likely relied on trust, reputation, and repeated contact, since formal contracts were not always written down or preserved. Some goods were valued for their material use, while others functioned as symbols of prestige and relationship. A foreign vessel of wine, for example, might do more than hold a drink. It could signal access, influence, or hospitality. In this way, trade was not only economic, it was social and political, shaping who could gift, display, and command respect. Coins eventually became part of the Celtic world as well, especially in areas closer to Greek and Roman influence. At first, coinage may have been valued as a prestige item or a source of metal, rather than as money in the modern sense. But over time, some Celtic groups adopted coin systems for payment, tribute, and trade. The designs can be striking: stylized horses, disjointed faces, abstract patterns, and names of rulers or tribes, depending on the place and period. These images suggest both imitation and transformation, since coin-making often borrowed from foreign models but reshaped them into local visual languages. Archaeologists and historians still study these coins to understand power, mobility, and identity. A hoard buried in the ground can hint at insecurity, ritual hiding, or simple storage that was never recovered. A scattered find may suggest markets, warfare, or migration. Coins also reveal the uneven pace of change in Celtic societies. Some groups used them widely, while others continued older exchange practices for generations. The clinking of metal in a pouch may have been a new sound in some communities, yet it entered a world already familiar with livestock wealth, gift exchange, and prestige objects. Alongside trade and craft, the Celts lived with a deep and practical awareness of landscape. Rivers, bogs, hills, forests, and springs were not blank scenery, they were active parts of life and belief. A hill could serve as a lookout, a meeting place, a burial ground, or a fortified center. A river might mark a boundary, offer fish and transport, or carry symbolic meaning beyond its visible banks. Bogs, especially in northwestern Europe, preserved objects remarkably well, and many deposits of weapons, tools, and sometimes human remains have been found in them. Some scholars think these were offerings, while others suggest they reflect emergency disposal or boundary marking, though often the most likely answer includes several motives at once. Springs and wells also seem to have been important places of reverence, perhaps because water appeared mysterious, life-giving, and constant. In many later Celtic traditions, watery places remained linked to healing, vows, and otherworldly presence. To live in such a landscape was to move through layers of meaning. The same marsh that made travel difficult could also become a sacred threshold, and the same hill that caught the wind could become a place of watchfulness and memory. The Celts are also remembered for their warrior culture, though it is important not to reduce them to battle alone. Still, weapons, armor, and martial display played a visible role in many communities, especially among the elite. Swords, spears, shields, and occasionally helmets or mail were not merely tools of violence. They were signs of status, courage, and readiness. Some burial finds suggest that certain individuals were interred with weapons as a statement of identity, while in other cases weapons appear to have been deliberately bent, broken, or deposited, perhaps as offerings after conflict or ritual acts. Classical authors often emphasize the fierce appearance of Celtic warriors, their loud charges, and their striking ornaments, but such descriptions can be shaped by fear and literary convention. What can be said more carefully is that warfare was woven into politics, resource competition, and honor. A warrior's reputation could travel farther than the body itself. Shining metal, painted shields, and decorated horse gear may have created a dramatic scene before battle, with noise, color, and movement building tension in the air. Yet behind the image of heroism lay the ordinary consequences of raiding, defense, and territorial pressure. The social world of the Celts was not only shaped by men and warriors. Women could hold significant standing, though the evidence is uneven and often filtered through outsiders' voices. Some literary sources mention powerful queens or women who spoke publicly, owned property, or influenced alliances. Archaeology, too, sometimes points to high-status female burials with jewelry, mirror, or imported items. It is difficult to know how common such cases were, because surviving evidence is fragmentary and exceptional finds can distort the whole picture. Still, it seems clear that women played essential roles in household management, production, kinship, and perhaps political negotiation. The weaving of cloth, preparation of food, care of children, and maintenance of domestic space were not minor tasks, but central forms of labor that sustained the community. In later Celtic legends, women often appear as wise figures, sovereign beings, healers, or carriers of fate, suggesting long and complex traditions around female authority. Whether those stories preserve ancient social realities or later imaginative memory, they show that the Celtic world was not a simple hierarchy of spear and shield alone. It was also a world of domestic labor, inherited ties, and influence that could be quiet yet enduring. Language is one of the richest clues to Celtic identity. The Celtic languages form a branch of the larger Indo-European family and eventually developed into forms that included Gaulish, Celtiberian, Welsh, Breton, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Manx, Cornish, and others. Not all of these were spoken at the same time, and some are much later than the Iron Age Celts, but they preserve echoes of older speech. Inscriptions, personal names, place names, and borrowings into other languages allow scholars to reconstruct parts of this linguistic history. The problem is that the Celts themselves left relatively little written material in comparison with later literate cultures, so their language must often be approached indirectly. Classical writers sometimes used broad labels, while local communities may have understood identity in more regional or kin-based ways. Even so, language mattered profoundly. It carried legal terms, kinship terms, poetry, insults, praise, and sacred formulae. A name could preserve memory over generations, and a place name could hold the shape of an old landscape long after the original speakers. One of the most fascinating things about the Celtic world is how often it appears just at the edge of visibility, half seen through the writings of outsiders. The Celts themselves left very little long-form literature from the ancient period. So much of what we know comes from archaeology, scattered inscriptions, later medieval manuscripts, and the accounts of Greek and Roman observers. That means the historical picture is always a little soft around the edges, like a landscape seen through mist. And yet, even with those gaps, one detail comes through clearly. The Celts were not a single frozen people, but many related communities spread across a wide range of lands, from the Atlantic edges of Iberia to the islands of Britain and Ireland, and deep into continental Europe. Their languages, customs, and identities varied greatly, but they shared enough of a cultural family resemblance that ancient writers noticed them as a broad and striking presence. In some places, the word Celtic is still used with caution by scholars because it can simplify what was likely a very complex mosaic. Still, the broader pattern remains real, and it is in those differences as much as in the similarities that their world begins to feel alive. When we turn to the homes and settlements of Celtic communities, the image becomes much more grounded and intimate. Many people imagine only hill forts and warriors, but everyday life was built around farms, roundhouses, workshops, and family spaces where ordinary tasks unfolded with patient rhythm. In some regions, especially in Britain and Ireland, the roundhouse became a familiar domestic form, its circular walls and thatched roof creating a warm shelter against wind and rain. Hearth smoke would drift upward inside, carrying the scent of wood, peat, and cooking grain. Around these homes, people raised cattle, sheep, pigs, and crops like barley and wheat, depending on the region and the soil. Storage pits and granaries reveal concern for winter, scarcity, and planning ahead. It is easy to focus on the dramatic objects preserved in museums, but most Celtic lives were spent in practical labor, grinding grain, mending tools, spinning thread, tending animals, and sharing food. These were communities that understood the seasonality of survival, and their settlements reflect a deep relationship with land and weather. Even their grandest fortified sites were not only places of defense, but also centers of social life, trade, and identity, where a local world could gather itself together. That social world was held together not just by chiefs and warriors, but by specialists whose roles were highly respected. Among the most famous of these were the Druids, though their exact historical reality is still wrapped in uncertainty. Ancient writers described them as priests, judges, teachers, philosophers, and keepers of sacred knowledge, and while such descriptions may be colored by Roman fascination and fear, they suggest that Druids were more than simple religious figures. They appear to have occupied a learned and authoritative place in Celtic societies, preserving ritual traditions and possibly serving as mediators in disputes. Because the Celts left so little writing of their own in the earliest period, much of what seems Druidic is reconstructed from fragments and later imagination, which means the line between history and legend can be difficult to draw. Still, the importance of oral knowledge is clear. Memory mattered. Names, genealogies, laws, and sacred stories could live in the spoken word across generations. In a world where the voice carried authority, the trained memory itself was a kind of power, and learning was not separate from spiritual life. That connection between wisdom, ritual, and social order gave Celtic society a texture that was both practical and deeply symbolic. Trade also shaped the Celtic world in subtle and far-reaching ways. The Celts were not isolated mountain dwellers cut off from the rest of Europe. They were active participants in a broad network of exchange that moved metal, salt, wine, pottery, glass, cloth, amber, and ideas. Archaeological discoveries show connections stretching across rivers and sea routes, linking inland settlements to Mediterranean markets and northern coasts. Imported goods, especially in elite contexts, suggest a taste for distinction and display. A finely made vessel or a bright foreign object could signal status, generosity, or alliance. Yet trade was not only about wealth, it was about contact, adaptation, and the slow blending of artistic styles. Celtic craftsmen absorbed influences from Greek, Etruscan, Roman, and later Germanic worlds, reworking them into something distinctively local. The famous Latin style, with its curving lines, plant-like forms, and energetic abstraction, is one result of this creative exchange. It feels almost in motion, as if metal itself were growing vines and unfurling leaves. This artistic vitality is one reason Celtic art still seems so modern to many viewers. It was never static decoration. It was a visual language of movement, transformation, and living force. Among the most beautiful expressions of that language are the objects fashioned by Celtic metalworkers. Their skill in bronze, iron, gold, and enamel was remarkable, and much of it survives in tools, ornaments, weapons, and ceremonial pieces. Some of these objects were made for everyday use, but many were clearly designed to impress. Torques, those heavy neck rings often associated with Celtic elites, could be made of twisted gold or bronze, polished to catch the light. Brooches, helmets, shields, and sword fittings often combined function with artistic flourish, turning practical items into statements of prestige. The craftsmanship required a steady hand and deep technical knowledge, but also an eye for proportion and pattern. In a dim workshop with charcoal heat, hammer blows, and the glow of metal, a craftsman could shape a design that would last for centuries buried in the earth. Some finds, like the richly decorated shields and cauldrons recovered from wetlands and burial sites, seem to have had ritual significance as well as practical value. They remind us that for the Celts, beauty and sacredness were often intertwined. An object could be useful, powerful, and symbolic all at once, carrying the presence of the maker and the meaning of the community. Animals, too, occupied a meaningful place in Celtic life and imagination. Cattle were especially important, not only as sources of milk and meat, but as measures of wealth and social standing. In many early societies, livestock represented portable value, and that was certainly true in Celtic regions as well. But beyond economic importance, animals appear repeatedly in art, myth, and ritual. Horses, boars, stags, birds, and serpents all seem to have held deep symbolic resonance. The boar, in particular, appears often in Celtic imagery, perhaps associated with ferocity, courage, and the wild energy of the forest. Horses were linked with movement, nobility, and travel, and some Celtic goddesses and gods appear closely connected to them. Even the natural world itself seems to have been regarded with a vivid attentiveness, as if each creature carried a special voice in the larger pattern of life. The Celts lived close to their animals, relying on them daily, and this closeness likely fed a rich symbolic imagination. It is difficult to know exactly what a given image meant in every region, because meanings could shift from place to place. But the repetition of animal forms suggests a worldview in which human life, animal life, and sacred life were not sharply separated. They flowed together, like streams joining in a broader current. That closeness to nature also gave the landscape itself a deep importance. Rivers, groves, springs, lakes, hills, and boundary places were often treated as more than scenery. They were active presences, places where the world could be touched in special ways. Archaeology has uncovered many votive offerings in wetlands, rivers, and watery places, where people seem to have deposited weapons, jewelry, tools, and other valuables. Sometimes these were deliberate sacrifices, perhaps made to divine forces or ancestral powers. The waterlogged preservation of these objects allows modern scholars a rare glimpse into practices that were once hidden from ordinary view. A sword bent before being placed in a marsh or a bronze vessel lowered into a lake suggests an act of release and exchange, as if an offering were being sent into another realm. Sacred springs also appear frequently in later Celtic tradition, often continuing long after the ancient world had changed. It is tempting to imagine these places in silence, with reeds moving at the water's edge and a few small objects resting below the surface, carried there by hands that asked for healing, fertility, victory, or favor. The landscape was not neutral. It listened. Language, meanwhile, was one of the most enduring legacies of the Celtic peoples, even though the ancient linguistic map is intricate and still partly debated. Celtic languages formed a branch of the Indo-European family, and over time they spread and diversified into several major forms. Some developed in continental Europe and later vanished under the pressure of Romanization and other language shifts. Others survived on the Atlantic fringe, eventually giving rise to Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Manx, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. These languages are not identical, of course, but they preserve deep continuities in grammar, vocabulary, and poetic style. Their survival is remarkable, especially considering the political upheavals that repeatedly challenged them. Languages can carry memory in ways that monuments cannot. A greeting, a proverb, a place name, or an old poetic form can preserve traces of an older world with extraordinary durability. Even where the ancient Celts did not leave us many written records, their linguistic descendants keep whispering back across time. Scholars continue to study inscriptions, loanwords, and reconstructed forms in order to understand how these languages sounded and changed. And because the evidence is fragmentary, the study itself remains a careful, ongoing unfolding rather than a finished portrait. In the later Celtic world, especially in Britain and Ireland, storytelling became one of the richest ways cultural memory survived. Medieval manuscripts preserve mythological cycles, heroic tales, lore tracts, genealogies, and devotional texts, many of which likely draw on much older oral traditions. These stories were copied by Christian scribes, which means they reached us through minds shaped by a different religious world, but they still preserve unmistakably ancient textures. Heroes travel through enchanted. By the time we look more closely at Celtic society, one of the most striking things is how deeply it seems to have been organized around honor, memory, and personal reputation. In many Celtic communities, status was not simply a matter of wealth or ancestry alone, but of the stories people carried about themselves and the gifts they could give, the feasts they could host, and the courage they were believed to show. A person's standing might be reflected in the quality of their weapons, the metalwork on a brooch, the number of followers they could gather, or the respect they commanded at a gathering. Scholars often describe this as a gift economy or an honor economy, though the exact details varied widely from place to place and changed over time. What survives in the record suggests a world where relationships mattered intensely and where prestige moved through exchange, hospitality, and public recognition. Even the quiet rustle of bronze ornaments or the glow of a polished talk may have carried meaning beyond beauty, speaking of identity, obligation, and rank in a society that remembered people through what they gave and how they were remembered in return. Alongside this concern for status was a strong attachment to the household, the farmstead, and the practical rhythms of life. The Celts were not only warriors in the imagination of later writers, they were also farmers, herders, craftworkers, and traders whose days were shaped by the turning of the seasons. Archaeology reveals enclosures, storage pits, hearths, grain remains, and animal bones that point to communities carefully managing food, land, and livestock. Cattle were especially important in many areas, though sheep, pigs, and horses also had their places in the economy and in ritual life. In the soft light of morning, one can imagine smoke rising from a roundhouse, the scent of grain drying near the fire, and the low sounds of animals at the edge of a settlement. These were not remote, abstract societies but lived-in landscapes of labor and care. The grandeur of metalwork and warrior display existed beside the everyday tasks of grinding grain, mending fences, and preparing for another uncertain winter. As we move through the evidence, it becomes clear that Celtic languages were once spoken across a remarkably broad span of Europe. They belong to the wider Indo-European family, but they developed into distinct branches that spread through different regions. Some Celtic tongues survived in the far western edges of Europe, while others vanished long ago, known only through inscriptions, place names, and the testimony of classical authors. The movement of Celtic speech did not happen all at once, and it was never a simple wave sweeping across a blank map. Instead, it unfolded through centuries of migration, trade, elite influence, and cultural exchange. Linguists continue to debate exactly how and where the earliest Celtic languages formed, whether in Central Europe, along Atlantic routes, or through more complex networks of contact. What remains certain is that the Celtic linguistic world was once much wider than the modern Celtic languages of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, and the Isle of Man might suggest. In that broader soundscape, a name, a greeting, or a legal formula could travel far, crossing rivers and hills and carrying memory through speech. The social world of the Celts also seems to have placed great importance on oral skill. Storytelling, poetry, legal memory, and praise could all shape a person's standing. Classical writers often remarked on Celtic eloquence, and later medieval traditions preserved a rich inheritance of poets and learned specialists. These traditions are separated by time and cannot be treated as exact mirrors of one another, yet they hint at a culture where spoken words had weight. Before texts became common, memory itself was a form of power. A well-trained speaker could preserve genealogies, laws, heroic tales, and ritual knowledge. In a hall lit by fire, the cadence of recitation may have been as memorable as music, with repeated phrases and rhythmic patterns helping words settle into the mind. Some scholars believe such oral traditions were essential to maintaining social order in communities where writing was limited or reserved for specific purposes. Even today, the surviving stories suggest that speech was never merely decorative. It could bless, judge, persuade, boast, and bind people together in bonds that were at once fragile and enduring. Another gentle but important fact is that Celtic religion was never a single fixed system. There is no simple Celtic pantheon that neatly covers all regions and eras. Instead, there were many local gods, goddesses, sacred places, and ritual practices, some of which are known only from inscriptions or later literary echoes. Rivers, wells, groves, and hilltops often appear as sacred spaces, suggesting that the landscape itself was alive with significance. Offerings of metalwork, weapons, coins, and personal items have been found in bogs, rivers, and lakes, where they were placed deliberately and often with great care. These deposits may have been linked to vows, gratitude, danger, or transitions between worlds, though the exact meanings can be difficult to recover. The water, the mud, the stillness of reeds at the edges of a marsh all seem to have belonged to a ceremonial atmosphere that was both practical and mysterious. Ritual life may have unfolded not only in formal sanctuaries, but in the open air, in places where earth and water felt close together, and where gifts to unseen powers could disappear beneath the surface. In some regions, the Celts also developed impressive fortifications and defended settlements that rose above the surrounding land. Hill forts are among the most recognizable archaeological features associated with Iron Age Europe, and they appear in a variety of forms, from simple enclosed hilltops to complex, sprawling centers with multiple lines of earthworks. Some were probably permanent settlements, while others may have served seasonal, political, or ceremonial roles. Their walls and ramparts did not always mean constant war. Sometimes they signaled community organization, control of resources, or the display of power. From a distance, these sites could look imposing in the half-light, their banks and ditches tracing the contours of the land. Inside, there may have been houses, workshops, livestock pens, and spaces for gathering. The defensive aspect is real, but so is the social one. A hill fort was not just a military structure. It could also have been a focus of identity, a place where people met, exchanged goods, and recognized the authority of local elites whose influence was tied to land and kinship. Trade, too, quietly shaped the Celtic world in ways that are sometimes overlooked when attention stays fixed on battle and ritual. Celtic communities were connected to wider networks that carried amber, salt, wine, textiles, metal, and ideas across long distances. Some of these exchanges linked the interior of Europe with Mediterranean cultures, especially through routes controlled or influenced by Etruscans, Greeks, and later Romans. Imported objects sometimes appear in elite grave or settlement sites, where they speak of taste, diplomacy, and status. A bronze vessel, a bead, or a drinking cup might travel far from its place of origin before becoming part of a local display of wealth. Yet trade was not only about luxury. Everyday items, raw materials, and practical techniques also moved. The movement of goods helped shape artistic styles and social habits, and it reminds us that the Celtic world was never isolated. Even in remote-looking valleys or windswept coasts, people were part of a wider fabric of contact, one that brought unfamiliar shapes, tastes, and materials into familiar lives. The artistry associated with the Celts remains one of their most captivating legacies. Long before the romantic imagery of later centuries, Iron Age metalworkers were producing elegant, complex forms that combined curves, spirals, tendrils, animals, and abstract patterns. The Latin style, often linked with later Iron Age Celtic art, is especially famous for its flowing designs that seem to move like reeds in water or smoke rising from a hearth. These objects were not mass-produced in the modern sense. They were made with skill, patience, and a strong sense of visual balance. A sword scabbard, shield boss, mirror back, or brooch could be as much a statement of identity as a tool or weapon. Some designs feel almost contemplative in their repetition, inviting the eye to drift. The exact symbolic meanings of many motifs remain uncertain, and scholars are careful not to impose too much certainty on patterns that may have meant different things in different places. Still, the craftsmanship itself is undeniable, and it speaks of societies that valued refinement as much as force. Burial customs offer another quiet window into Celtic life, though they are never uniform. In some regions and periods, cremation was common, in others, inhumation prevailed. Grave goods might include weapons, ornaments, pottery, tools, or imported vessels, but not every burial was richly furnished. The choices made in funerary practice likely reflected local customs, family traditions, social rank, and changing beliefs about death and remembrance. Some grave emphasize a warrior identity, while others center on adornment or domestic life. In the stillness of a burial mound or enclosed cemetery, one can sense both loss and continuity. The dead were not simply forgotten. They were placed within landscapes of memory, sometimes near settlements or on prominent ground, where ancestors could remain part of the living world. Yet the evidence is uneven, and the meaning of grave goods is often debated. Were they offerings for the afterlife, symbols for the mourners, markers of status, or all of these at once? The answer may differ from one community to another, leaving us with a respectful uncertainty that suits the fragmentary record. Another subtle feature of Celtic history is the variety of ways in which leadership seems to have been organized. There was no single Celtic political system, no empire uniting all Celtic peoples under one rule. Instead, power appears to have been local, shifting, and often personal. Chiefs, kings, client relationships, warrior retinues, and kin groups all likely played roles, though the exact balance differed greatly from one area to another. Authority may have depended on generosity, military success, sacred legitimacy, and the ability to mediate disputes. Later sources sometimes emphasize, by the time we reach the later centuries of Celtic history, one of the most striking developments is the gradual spread of Christianity through many Celtic-speaking regions, not as a single sudden change, but as a slow and uneven blending of old and new ways. In Ireland, for example, the 5th century is often associated with the figure of Patrick, though the details of his life are difficult to separate from later legend. What can be said with more confidence is that Christian communities took root and began to reshape learning, worship, and daily ritual. The old rhythms of seasonal life did not vanish overnight. Instead, they seem to have softened and altered, with older customs lingering in local practice even as monasteries, prayers, and written scripture became increasingly central. The quiet stone chapels and manuscript workshops of early medieval Celtic lands suggest a world where faith was becoming more textual, more organized, and yet still deeply shaped by local memory and landscape. In many places, the transition would have felt less like a sharp break than like a new light, gradually entering an older room. This blending of traditions can be sensed most vividly in the remarkable monastic culture that grew in Ireland and later influenced parts of Britain and continental Europe. Monasteries became places not only of devotion, but of teaching, copying, and preservation. In an age when much of Europe was experiencing political fragmentation and shifting authority, these communities could function as islands of relative stability. Monks copied Latin texts, produced illuminated manuscripts, and maintained scholarly habits that connected them to wider Christian learning. Yet the style of these communities often retained a distinctly local character. Their art, with its spiraling motifs, interlaced beasts, and intricate borders, seems to echo older Celtic visual traditions even as it serves Christian purposes. In the stillness of these scriptoria, one can imagine the soft scrape of quills, the faint smell of parchment, and the steady patience required to fill page after page with complex ornament. The famous Book of Kells, though later than the earliest monastic phase, stands as a vivid reminder of this fusion. Christian scripture framed by a decorative world that still feels alive with earlier artistic energies. Alongside these spiritual changes came the slow emergence of written forms for Celtic languages. For much of earlier Celtic history, memory and oral transmission carried the burden of tradition. Stories, genealogies, legal formulas, and heroic cycles lived first in speech, in recitation, in the careful training of poets and learned professionals. But with the spread of literacy, especially through monasteries and courts, languages such as Old Irish began to appear in written form. This mattered greatly because writing did not simply record speech, it also changed how language could be preserved, analyzed, and standardized. Scholars today study old glosses, marginal notes, legal tracts, and poetry to reconstruct the structure of these languages and the thought worlds they served. The surviving material is fragmentary, yet it offers a rare glimpse into a culture at the moment when oral and written traditions were coexisting. One can picture a learned scribe leaning over a manuscript, adding a brief explanation in the margin, perhaps to clarify a difficult Latin phrase for students who spoke a Celtic tongue at home. Such small traces can carry an entire intellectual landscape within them. Even as literacy expanded, the older prestige of poets and learned historians did not disappear. In many Celtic societies, the poet was not merely an entertainer, but a custodian of memory, status, and legitimacy. Genealogies were treasured because they tied families to ancestry, land, and honor. Praise poetry could elevate a ruler, while satire could wound reputation in ways that were socially meaningful and sometimes feared. The exact power of the poet varied from place to place and from century to century, but the social importance of skilled verbal art seems undeniable. In Ireland, the learned class known as the Fillid developed complex traditions of training, meter, and historical knowledge. Their work belonged to a world where spoken language could be formal, ceremonial, and highly controlled. Even now, when the surviving poetry is read silently on a page, it can still seem intended for the ear, with its careful patterning and rhythmic balance. There is something soothing in imagining these verses first carried by voice, perhaps in a hall lit by firelight, where listeners would have heard not just words, but the familiar cadence of continuity. The law traditions of the Celtic world are another area where surviving evidence invites both fascination and caution. Irish law texts, often called Brehon laws, preserve a highly structured system of social relations, compensation, status, and obligation. They reveal a society organized not simply by punishment, but by calibrated responses to injury and conflict. The terms and categories can feel surprisingly detailed, yet the texts themselves were written down in a medieval period, not necessarily unchanged from earlier practice. So scholars remain careful about how directly these laws reflect pre-Christian or ancient Celtic society. Still, they offer valuable evidence for a legal imagination that was rooted in community balance rather than centralized state authority. Land rights, fosterage, marriage arrangements, and honor price all appear in these texts as matters of serious public importance. One can almost sense the practical atmosphere of legal discussion, men and women negotiating obligations, elders weighing precedent, and scribes preserving distinctions that mattered deeply to everyday life. The result is not a simplistic picture of ancient customs, but a layered and evolving legal culture. Fosterage, in particular, was a notable feature of many Celtic societies, especially in Ireland and parts of Britain. Children were often sent to be raised by another household, sometimes for educational reasons, sometimes to strengthen alliances, and sometimes to create bonds of loyalty that lasted into adulthood. This practice could produce enduring emotional and political relationships between families, making kinship broader and more flexible than a simple biological model. A child raised away from the parent's home might learn skills, values, and stories from a different environment, while still remaining tied to their original lineage. In a society where honor and relationship mattered so much, fosterage could be a powerful bridge between households. The arrangement may sound unusual to modern ears, yet it likely felt familiar and practical in its own historical setting. A quieter home, a second hearth, another set of voices and routines, all of these could shape a person's sense of belonging. The emotional texture of fosterage helps us understand how Celtic societies maintained networks of trust across distance and difference. Trade and exchange also connected Celtic lands to wider Europe and the Mediterranean, though the patterns changed greatly over time. In earlier centuries, elite goods such as wine, jewelry, and finely made vessels moved through networks that linked the Celtic world to Greek, Roman and later post-Roman economies. Even in more isolated regions, imported objects could carry prestige far beyond their practical use. A single amber bead, a metal brooch, or a decorated drinking cup might signal status, alliance, or access to distant contacts. Archaeologists uncover such items in graven settlements, where they speak quietly of movement and connection. The sea, especially around Ireland, Western Britain, and the Atlantic coast, was not a barrier but a route. Boats stitched together communities separated by water, allowing people, stories, and materials to travel with the tides. One might imagine the smell of salt and wood pitch, the creak of a vessel under oars or sail, and the careful wrapping of precious cargo against damp air. Even when political borders shifted, the practical web of exchange continued to link one shore to another. Another enduring theme in Celtic history is adaptation under Roman influence, particularly in regions that came under imperial rule, such as Gaul and much of Britain. Roman administration, urban life, roads, military presence, and material culture transformed local societies in profound ways. Yet the Celtic identity of these regions did not simply vanish into a uniform Roman world. Local deities were sometimes identified with Roman ones, languages persisted in various forms, and elite families often navigated both traditions at once. The archaeology of Roman Gaul and Roman Britain reveals a complex blending rather than total replacement. Villas, baths, inscriptions, and temples stood alongside local customs and regional identities. For some communities, Roman rule may have offered opportunity and mobility. For others, it would have felt like pressure, taxation, and disruption. The historical record rarely preserves the full emotional range of these experiences. Still, the material remains hint at lives lived in contact zones, where adaptation was constant and identity was negotiated in everyday choices. The later early medieval period also saw growing regional differentiation among Celtic-speaking peoples. Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, Brittany, and the Isle of Man each developed distinctive political and cultural paths, even while remaining connected through language family, seaborne contact, and shared intellectual traditions. This is one reason the singular word Celtic can be both useful and misleading. It helps gather related histories under one broad umbrella, yet each region had its own chronology and social reality. Political fragmentation could produce small kingdoms, shifting alliances and local dynasties, while church organization and literary production created channels of broader exchange. In Wales, for example, poetry and law flourished in forms distinct from those in Ireland. In Brittany, migration and settlement from Britain reshaped the linguistic landscape. On the Isle of Man, Norse influence later became especially important. These differences remind us that cultural continuity is rarely neat. It is often braided, like a river delta, with multiple channels flowing at once, each carrying a different shade of the same water. The arts of metalwork and ornament continue to hold deep significance in these societies, not only as displays of wealth, but as expressions of identity, craftsmanship, and symbolic power. Brooches, pins, torques, bells, and book shrines could be exquisitely made, combining native traditions with Christian motifs or external influences. Objects were often both beautiful and functional, and the line between adornment and sacred item could be thin. The famous insular style, seen in manuscripts and metalwork, reflects this extraordinary visual culture. Dense patterning, interlace, spirals, and animal forms unfolding into almost hypnotic complexity. By the time the Romans wrote more detailed accounts of the Celtic world, one of the most striking things they noticed was the importance of the grove. For many Celtic communities, sacred places were not always enclosed by walls or built into grand stone temples, but found among trees, springs, and quiet clearings where the natural world itself seemed to hold meaning. Later writers, especially those looking from outside, described these wooded sanctuaries with a mix of fascination and fear. and it is not always easy to separate fact from dramatic storytelling. Even so, archaeology and place names suggest that certain natural sites were deeply respected over a long period of time. A grove might serve as a meeting place, a location for offerings, or a boundary between the ordinary world and something more mysterious. In the dim light beneath old branches, with wind moving softly through leaves, one can imagine why such places felt suitable for prayer, memory, and ritual. They would have offered shade in summer, shelter from rain, and a sense of stillness that suited a people whose religion was closely tied to landscape. In that quiet, the living world and the unseen world could seem very near each other. Water, too, occupied a special place in Celtic life, and not only in practical terms. Rivers, wells, lakes, and springs were often treated as sacred presences, worthy of gifts and careful attention. Across the Celtic regions of Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of offerings placed into water, from weapons and tools to ornaments and other valuables. Some of these deposits may have marked vows fulfilled, while others may have been intended as requests for healing, fertility, or protection. In later folklore, certain wells became associated with cures, blessings, and seasonal custom, which may echo far older beliefs. It is easy to picture a cold spring emerging from stone, surrounded by moss and reeds, where people would have paused in silence before lowering a polished object into the dark surface. Water changes so much as it moves, and perhaps that is part of why it carried such symbolic force. It could nourish fields, mark territory, and connect communities along a river's course, but it could also conceal what had been given to it. For the Celts, as for many ancient peoples, water was never only water. It was memory, passage, and power, flowing steadily through everyday life. Among the most enduring images linked to Celtic society is the role of the bard, the poet, singer, and keeper of stories. In later Irish and Welsh traditions, bards were not merely entertainers. They were guardians of lineage, praise, satire, and communal memory, and their words could carry real social weight. The historical reality behind the legend is complex, because written records come late and often preserve a mixture of older practice and later idealization. Still, it seems clear that oral artistry held a central place in Celtic culture. Long before books became common, history was remembered in names, repeated genealogies, heroic tales, and poems spoken aloud in halls or open air. A bard might celebrate a ruler's generosity, preserve the fame of a warrior, or deliver criticism sharp enough to sting. In some traditions, poets were believed to possess an almost sacred authority, as if language itself were a form of craft and influence. The cadence of those recited lines, perhaps measured and musical, would have settled into the room like breath. In a culture where memory had to be carried by human voices, the poet was a vessel of the past, and also a shaper of how that past was understood. The Celts were also renowned for their skills in metalwork, especially in the creation of elaborate jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial objects. Their art often favored swirling curves, intricate patterns, and stylized forms that seem alive with movement. Scholars often describe this as part of the Latin artistic tradition, named after a site in Switzerland where many artifacts were found. The style is recognizable for its elegant complexity, yet it changed over time and across regions, adapting to local tastes and influences. Some pieces were made for daily use, while others were clearly crafted for display, ritual, or burial. Torque necklaces, for example, became one of the most iconic symbols of Celtic status and craftsmanship. Made from twisted metal, sometimes in gold, bronze, or iron, they would have gleamed against the skin, catching light in a way that made the wearer seem almost transformed. Producing such objects required not only technical ability, but also access to materials, fuel, and skilled labor. The hammering of bronze, the shaping of gold, the careful inlay of decoration all speak to communities where artistry and prestige were closely linked. Even now, when such objects are viewed in a museum case, their curves still feel quietly alive. In many Celtic societies, status was visible not only in ornaments but also in the horse. Horses appear frequently in Celtic art, myth, and archaeology, suggesting that they were deeply valued animals, associated with wealth, travel, warfare, and possibly divinity. Some regions produced horse gear in impressive quantities, and elite burials often included equipment linked to mounted life or chariot use. The horse gave speed and mobility in a landscape of rivers, hills, and open plains, and those qualities would have mattered greatly in both conflict and exchange. The animal also seems to have carried symbolic significance. In later Celtic traditions, horse-related deities and horse imagery remain common, though direct lines of continuity are difficult to prove. What is clear is that the horse offered practical power and social prestige together. Its breath in cold air, the soft sound of hooves on earth, the leather and metal of harness and bridle, all would have formed part of a world in which movement itself was a mark of importance. A horse could carry a message, a noble, a warrior, or a sense of authority. To own and display, one was to participate in a visible language of rank. The social structure of Celtic peoples was not uniform, but many accounts and archaeological findings point to a society shaped by hierarchy, patronage, and kinship. At the top were elites who controlled land, tribute, military alliances, and public generosity. Beneath them were free farmers, artisans, clients, dependents, and in some areas enslaved people. This does not mean every Celtic community was organized in exactly the same way, and the details varied considerably from region to region. Yet status mattered, and it appears to have been maintained through networks of loyalty as much as through force. Leaders gave protection, feasting, and distribution of wealth, while followers offered service and support. In such a system, a great hall or stronghold would have been more than a residence. It was a place where relationships were negotiated over food, drink, gifts, and speech. The atmosphere in those spaces may have shifted from lively to solemn with little warning, depending on the occasion. A shared bowl, a declaration of alliance, a story recited before an audience, all could reinforce social bonds. Though modern people often imagine the ancient world as either strictly rigid or wildly chaotic, Celtic life seems to have been sustained by a delicate balance of obligation, reputation, and negotiated power. Warfare was another defining feature of many Celtic communities, at least in the eyes of ancient writers, and in the remains of weapons, defences, and fortified sites. Yet warfare was not merely a matter of constant violence. It was also tied to honour, leadership, raiding, display, and the protection of territory. Celtic warriors were often described as fierce and highly individual, and while such descriptions may exaggerate for dramatic effect, they likely reflect a real emphasis on personal reputation in battle. Helmets, shields, spears, swords, and decorative fittings reveal a martial culture that cared about both effectiveness and appearance. The shield, in particular, could become a symbol of identity, painted or ornamented in distinctive ways. Fortified hilltops and enclosures offered refuge and strategic advantage, but also communicated power from a distance. On a misty ridge, with smoke rising from domestic hearths and sentries watching the horizon, a hill fort would have seemed both practical and symbolic, a place where community and defense came together. It is worth remembering that for many people, warfare was intermittent rather than constant, breaking out in seasonal raids or political disputes, and then receding again into the routines of farming and craft. Even so, its presence shaped social ambition and collective memory. Another aspect of Celtic life that emerges from both archaeology and historical references is the significance of feasting. Meals were not only for nourishment, they were occasions for alliance, storytelling, competition, and the display of generosity. Animal bones recovered from settlements and elite sites suggest communal consumption on a notable scale in some contexts, while vessels for drinking and serving indicate ceremonial behavior around food and drink. Feasting could confirm a leader's authority by showing that he could provide abundance, but it could also create obligations among those who received hospitality. In some traditions, the distribution of meat was politically charged, revealing status through who received the choicest portions. One can imagine the smell of roasting flesh, the low murmur of conversation, the clink of vessels, and the glow of firelight against wooden beams. Such scenes would not necessarily have been extravagant by modern standards, but they were likely meaningful in deeply social ways. The table, or its ancient equivalent, was a place where order could be made visible. A feast might celebrate a marriage, a victory, a seasonal turning, or simply the ties that held a community together through ordinary time. The Celts also left traces of sophisticated agricultural life, even though later popular imagination sometimes focuses more on warriors and druids than on ploughing, grazing, and harvest. In reality, farming formed the foundation of most Celtic economies. Cattle were especially important in many regions, serving as a measure of wealth, a source of milk and meat, and a central part of exchange. Sheep, pigs, goats, and cereals also mattered, and the rhythms of the year were shaped by planting, grazing, and storage. Settlement patterns show careful adaptation to local environments, whether in upland pasture. One of the most familiar images of the ancient Celts is the warrior with the long, patterned cloak, but their textiles were far more than decoration. Cloth carried identity, rank, and regional style, and in a world without modern labels, what someone wore could quietly say where they came from and how they wished to be seen. Wool was the most common fibre, sheep being practical and well suited to the climates where many Celtic communities lived. The dyeing of cloth was an important craft too, and colours did not appear by accident. Earthy reds, yellows, greens, and browns could be drawn from plants, roots, and minerals, while brighter shades required skill, time, and access to particular materials. Some surviving evidence suggests that Celtic clothing may have been surprisingly vivid, at least in certain contexts, rather than the dull, colourless world that older imagined reconstructions once suggested. Loom weights, spindle whorls, and textile fragments found in graven settlements remind us that weaving was not a marginal household task, but a central part of life. Much of this work would have been done by hand, in long, patient hours, with the soft rhythm of thread passing through the loom. In that quiet labour, everyday survival and cultural expression were woven together quite literally, strand by strand. Alongside clothing, the Celts developed a deep relationship with metalwork that became one of the most admired features of their material culture. Bronze and iron were shaped into tools, weapons, ornaments, and ritual objects with remarkable technical control. A great deal of Celtic art is not smooth or plain, but full of curling lines, flowing spirals, interlacing patterns, trumpet shapes, and repeated curves that seem almost to move when the eye lingers on them. This style, often associated with the Latin culture, gave metal objects a lively, almost breathing quality. Swords might have decorated hilts, scabbards, and fittings, while brooches could be both functional and beautifully elaborate. Even simple items could carry artistry, suggesting that beauty was not reserved only for the elite. The work itself required heat, fuel, charcoal, hammering, and careful timing, all in an era when a mistake could destroy a valuable piece. Archaeologists often find the remains of furnaces, anvils, molds, and metal scraps that show how practiced these artisans were. The objects that survive can feel surprisingly intimate, as if they still hold the memory of a hand that shaped them long ago. Their surfaces, once polished and bright, would have caught firelight in halls, or glinted in the sun at feasts and ceremonies, giving metal a kind of animated presence in Celtic life. Not all Celtic communities lived in small, scattered farms. In many regions, especially in the centuries before Roman conquest, larger settlement forms emerged that are often called oppida. These were not cities in the later classical sense, but they were more than simple villages. They could include defended enclosures, workshops, storage areas, elite residences, and places for trade or assembly. Some were built on hilltops, taking advantage of natural defences, while others occupied lowland sites near routes of movement and exchange. Their walls and ramparts sometimes took impressive forms, with timber, stone, and earth combined in complicated fortifications. The people who lived or gathered there may have included craft specialists, traders, warriors, and local leaders, all within a place that could feel busy at certain times and quiet at others. The term oppidum itself comes from Roman writers, so it is a label applied from outside, and scholars still debate exactly how to classify these places. Were they administrative centres, market towns, seasonal gathering sites, or something changing from one season to the next? The answer likely varies. What is clear is that Celtic society was not uniformly small-scale or isolated. There were hubs of concentration where goods, information, and power moved in more organised ways, and where the landscape itself was shaped into a social space. Trade played a major role in connecting Celtic communities to the wider ancient world. Through rivers, overland routes, and coastal exchange, the Celts came into contact with Greeks, Etruscans, Phoenicians, and later Romans. This did not mean the Celts simply copied foreign customs. Rather, they selected, adapted, and reworked imported goods in ways that suited local tastes and political needs. Mediterranean wine, amphory, fine pottery, coral amber, and prestige metal items all moved northward in varying amounts. In return, Celtic regions exported raw materials, slaves, livestock, metals, and crafted goods. Feasting sites and elite burials often reveal imported vessels, suggesting that trade items were woven into the performance of status. A wine cup, for example, was never just a cup. It could be a symbol of relationship, hospitality, or alliance. The movement of objects also carried ideas, styles, and technical knowledge, though not always in direct or obvious ways. A decorated vessel found in a burial mound can speak of distant shores while still belonging to a very local story. Trade routes could be slow, seasonal, and risky, depending on roads that were little more than tracks and on waters that could change with weather. Yet through this web of exchange, Celtic lands were linked to a broader ancient economy, one full of negotiation, curiosity, and careful display. Religion among the Celts was not confined to temples in the later Roman sense, though sacred places certainly existed. Many ritual landscapes appear to have been tied to natural features such as rivers, springs, marshes, groves, hilltops, and boundary zones. Water in particular seems to have held strong symbolic power. Offerings have been found in lakes, bogs, and river deposits, sometimes including weapons, jewelry, or human-made objects deliberately placed in places where retrieval would be difficult or impossible. Such acts suggest devotion, sacrifice, or the transfer of valuable things into the care of divine forces. Springs may have been associated with healing, fertility, or prophecy, while groves could mark spaces set apart for ritual attention. Because much of this evidence is archaeological rather than textual, interpretation remains cautious. The Celts left no single religious manual, and later writers often observed their practices through outsiders' eyes. Still, the pattern is clear enough to show that the sacred world was deeply embedded in the natural environment. To approach a river or a wood might have meant entering a place of unseen presence, where the boundary between ordinary and holy grew thin. In that setting, a thrown coin, a weapon lowered into water, or a carved object placed in mud could become part of a long, quiet conversation with powers that were never fully visible. The famous figure of the Druid has long fascinated people, partly because Druidic traditions were described by classical authors, and partly because later imagination filled in so many gaps. Druids seem to have been learned specialists, perhaps serving as priests, judges, teachers, poets, and advisors in different contexts. Ancient sources credit them with memory, legal knowledge, ritual authority, and in some accounts, philosophical teaching. They are often linked to sacred groves and to the recitation of long oral traditions. Yet the evidence is uneven, and much of what is popularly said about Druids was shaped by Roman and later medieval interpretations. It is safest to think of them not as a single uniform priesthood across all Celtic lands, but as a class of specialists whose roles could vary by region and time. Some may have acted as custodians of genealogy and lore, keeping track of kinship and claims in societies where memory mattered immensely. Others may have presided over sacrifice or seasonal ceremony. Because writing was not always used for these traditions, knowledge may have been passed through careful repetition, training, and disciplined recitation. That kind of learning would have required patience and attention, a mental craftsmanship as exacting in its own way as metalworking. The Druid thus stands at the edge of history and legend, a figure both partly knowable and deliberately veiled by the passage of time. Celtic society also depended heavily on kinship, alliance, and status, but these were not simple or fixed categories. Households, extended families, client relationships, and local power networks probably formed the basic texture of daily life. Chiefs or kings may have held authority through generosity, military leadership, sacred legitimacy, and the ability to attract followers. Gift-giving and hospitality were essential political tools. A feast was never only a feast. It could confirm alliances, display wealth, reward loyalty, and create obligations that lasted long after the dishes were cleared away. In oral societies, reputation mattered, and the stories told about a leader could help maintain power just as much as any fortification. Women's roles varied widely across time and region, and while many ancient sources focus on male warriors and rulers, archaeological evidence shows that women could hold significance as household managers, craft producers, ritual participants, and in some cases individuals of high status. Burial evidence can suggest carefully chosen clothing, jewelry, and imported items that marked identity in life and death. None of this means that Celtic societies were modern or egalitarian, but it does remind us that status was often negotiated through relationships rather than enforced only by institutions. A person's standing could be visible in metal torques around the neck, in the size of a banquet, or in the way others listened when they spoke. Warfare is another subject often associated with the Celts, and ancient writers frequently described Celtic fighters as fierce, loud, and formidable. Yet warfare was likely more complex than the dramatic images suggest. Armed conflict could range from raids and local feuds to organized campaigns by larger groups. Weapons such as spears, shields, swords, and daggers appear frequently in the archaeological record, but so do items that suggest display as much as combat. Some armor and helmets were functional, while others may have served symbolic or ceremonial purposes. The visual language of warfare mattered. A shield boss, a crest, a painted surface, or a bronze helmet could help project intimidation and rank. The classical sources often emphasize the bravery, even the aggression of Celtic warriors, though they also reveal Roman fascination and fear. At the same time, many people in Celtic societies were not warriors at all. They were farmers, herders, craftsmen, traders. In the later Roman world, the word Celt itself became a kind of drifting label, used in different ways by different writers, and that shifting language is part of what makes the ancient peoples of Western and Central Europe feel so difficult to pin down. To modern eyes, it can seem as though the Celts were a single, neatly bounded nation, but the historical record is softer than that. Roman authors often grouped many peoples together under broad names, sometimes for convenience, sometimes out of ignorance, and sometimes because they were trying to describe lands beyond the edge of their own familiar world. The result is that the Celts appear in history almost like a mist over the hills, visible in outlines rather than in sharp lines. Their identity was real, but it was layered, local, and changing. A tribe in Gaul, a community in Britain, and a people in Iberia might share some customs, language features, and artistic habits, yet still remain distinct from one another. Even in the ancient world, belonging was often more about tribe, territory, kinship, and alliance than about a single overarching national idea. So when we speak of the Celts, we are partly speaking about a family of cultures, connected by echoes and affinities, rather than one fixed and uniform civilization. That uncertainty, far from weakening the story, gives it a quieter depth, because it reminds us that history is often made of overlapping identities, not simple borders. Among the most graceful traces of Celtic culture is its art, which often seems to move like water. Curving lines, spirals, triskells, and intricate interlacing patterns appear again and again on metalwork, stone, and ornament, creating a visual language that feels alive and restless. Unlike art that seeks symmetry in a strict, formal way, Celtic design often delights in motion, in transformation, in shapes that seem to unfold into one another. A bronze brooch, a shield fitting, or a carved stone fragment might carry a pattern that seems to breathe when the light changes across it. Scholars have long noticed that these motifs were not merely decorative. They may have carried symbolic meanings related to continuity, life cycles, or the movement of power and prestige. Some designs were likely inspired by broader continental artistic currents, while others developed locally, blending older traditions with new influences from the Mediterranean world. Over time, Celtic artists became especially skilled at turning practical objects into things of subtle beauty. Even everyday items could be made to shine with deliberate elegance, and perhaps this is one reason Celtic art still feels so immediately recognizable. It does not sit still. It invites the eye to wander slowly, following one line into the next, as if the object itself were in quiet motion. Metalwork in particular was a field in which Celtic craftsmen excelled. Iron, bronze, gold, and silver were shaped into weapons, ornaments, vessels, torques, and ceremonial pieces with remarkable skill. A torque, that thick ring worn around the neck, could signify wealth, status, or heroic identity, and many surviving examples are astonishingly refined. The making of such objects required not only technical knowledge, but also access to materials, trade networks, and time. In some cases, the labor invested in a single object would have been immense, suggesting that these pieces were meant to do more than simply serve a function. They were statements, visible signs of rank and value. Celtic metalworkers learned to hammer, twist, cast, solder, and inlay with a precision that still impresses modern archaeologists. Some objects were buried as offerings, perhaps to gods, perhaps to ancestors, perhaps simply to mark important moments in a community's life. Others accompanied the dead into grave, where they remained hidden for centuries beneath soil and root. When these items are uncovered, they seem to carry a remarkable stillness, as though they had been waiting patiently in the dark. In that sense, Celtic metalwork gives us not only craftsmanship, but also a sense of how deeply material beauty could be woven into power, ritual, and memory. The Druids, so often surrounded by legend, were part of the religious and intellectual life of Celtic society, though exactly who they were and what they did is still partly obscured. Roman writers described them as priests, judges, teachers, and advisors, and these accounts have shaped the modern imagination for centuries. They were said to preserve sacred knowledge, perhaps especially through memory and oral instruction, rather than through ordinary writing. This does not mean they existed in some mystical vacuum beyond history. Rather, it suggests a learned class whose authority came from training, tradition, and ritual expertise. Druids may have overseen sacrifices, resolved disputes, interpreted signs, and instructed younger generations in lore and cosmology. Yet the surviving evidence is fragmentary and filtered through outsiders, especially Roman observers who were both fascinated by and hostile to them. Because of that, the Druids remain partly elusive, appearing in the record like figures at the edge of firelight. Later medieval traditions also reimagined them, adding new layers of meaning that can be difficult to separate from earlier reality. Still, it is clear that sacred specialists held an important place in Celtic communities, and that religious life was not a simple matter of temples and texts. It was also seasonal, communal, and deeply tied to spoken tradition, the kind of knowledge carried in the mind and passed from one voice to another. The Celtic year itself seems to have been marked by turning points that connected human life to the wider rhythms of nature. Festivals such as Samhain and Beltane, later recorded in Irish tradition, suggest a worldview in which thresholds mattered greatly. Samhain, associated with the end of the harvest and the beginning of the darker half of the year, carried an atmosphere of change and inwardness. Beltane, by contrast, belonged to fire, growth, cattle, and the opening of the brighter season. These moments were not necessarily uniform across all Celtic-speaking regions, and the details likely varied from place to place. But the broad pattern reveals a society attentive to the movement of the seasons, to the calving of livestock, the ripening of grain, and the fragile balance between safety and uncertainty. Fire may have played a special role, as both a practical and symbolic force. It warmed, protected, purified, and marked transition. One can imagine the glow of seasonal gatherings, the smell of smoke drifting through cold evening air, the slow gathering of people around a shared center of light. Such festivals would have helped organize memory as well as labor, giving communities a calendar that was felt in the body, in the land, and in the rising and falling of the year. Celtic society also seems to have placed enormous value on cattle, which were more than livestock in a narrow economic sense. They represented wealth, mobility, and social standing, and in some regions they were central to exchange, tribute, and warfare. In early Irish literature, cattle raids occupy a special place, revealing how closely prestige and possession could be linked. A herder's herd was not only food or trade, it was a visible measure of influence, survival, and honor. The grazing landscape itself would have shaped daily life, with seasonal movement across pasturelands, attention to weather, and constant awareness of the needs of animals. Cattle provided milk, hides, and eventually meat, but their importance went beyond utility. They were woven into stories, legal customs, and ritual life. The practical care of herds was therefore inseparable from wider social order. A raid on cattle was not merely theft, it was an attack on status, a disruption of relationships, and sometimes the spark for conflict that could spread through an entire region. Even now, the prominence of cattle in Celtic tradition helps us see how closely ancient economies were tied to the living landscape, where wealth had a heartbeat and could move across the fields at dawn. In many Celtic-speaking societies, the oral transmission of knowledge was a profound cultural force. Songs, genealogies, lore, poetry, and historical memory could all be carried in spoken form, preserved by specialists who trained to remember long sequences with precision. This oral world was not casual or improvised. It was structured, disciplined, and deeply respected. Poets and learned families may have guarded traditions that linked present communities to ancestral lines, heroic tales, and sacred places. The absence of widespread writing in some periods did not mean the absence of sophistication. On the contrary, memory had to be active, shared, and carefully maintained. A recited genealogy might establish legitimacy. A poem could praise a leader, preserve a place name, or record a moral lesson. Law, too, may have existed in forms that depended on recitation and communal acknowledgement. When later scribes finally wrote down many of these traditions, they were capturing voices that had already traveled a long path through generations. That means the surviving texts are both precious and layered, preserving older material while also reflecting the concerns of the people who recorded them. The oral culture of the Celts reminds us that knowledge does not always need a page to endure. Sometimes it lives most securely in cadence, repetition, and the patient training of memory. The Celts also left their mark on the wider Mediterranean world through trade, conflict, and encounter. They were not isolated at the edge of history, but active participants in networks that connected Europe across great distances. Amber, salt metals, textiles, and livestock moved along routes that bound communities together, while warriors, merchants, and emissaries carried stories as well as goods. Some Celtic groups came into contact with Greek colonies, Etruscans, and Romans, absorbing influences while preserving their own local identities. Imported objects found in burial sites suggest that prestige goods traveled far from their places of origin, passing through many hands before resting in elite contexts. These exchanges were not always peaceful, of course. There were raids, alliances, migrations, and wars, but even conflict reveals connection, because it depends on knowledge of the other side, on contact, and on the desire to seize or defend valuable resources. Through trade, the Celts encountered new artistic forms, new technologies, and new political pressures, yet they were not simply passive recipients. By the end of the Iron Age, many Celtic communities had developed ways of writing that blended local custom with borrowed Mediterranean letters, and this quiet fact reminds us that the Celts were never cut off from the wider ancient world. In parts of Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula, inscriptions appear on stone, pottery, and metalwork, often using Greek or Latin alphabets adapted to local sounds. Some messages are brief and practical, perhaps a name, a dedication, a mark of ownership, or a tribute to a god. Others are harder to interpret because the languages themselves are only partly understood. Even so, these surviving traces show people recording presence, memory, and identity in durable form. A scratched line on a vessel, a carved word on a monument, a name preserved by chance in the earth, all of these small details bring the ancient countryside a little closer. They suggest markets, sanctuaries, and workshops where spoken language passed into writing with a careful hand, and perhaps a sense of wonder. In the living world around them, the Celts were deeply attentive to trees, and not only in a poetic sense. Woodland provided fuel, shelter, timber, tools, and animal forage, but certain trees also seem to have held special cultural meaning. Oaks, yews, hazels, and rowans appear again and again in later folklore and in the surviving evidence of ritual landscapes. It is difficult to say exactly what every tribe believed, because much of the record comes from outsiders or from later traditions, yet the reverence for groves is clear enough. Ancient authors describe sacred groves where cutting a tree might have felt like a violation of divine order. In a sheltered clearing, leaves moving overhead, the air heavy with moss and damp bark, worship may have felt intimate and alive. The natural world was not merely background scenery. It was part of the moral and spiritual texture of daily life, a place where the visible and invisible seemed to meet quietly among roots and shadow. That sense of connection to place also shaped Celtic art, which often transformed ordinary objects into elegant patterns of movement. The famous Latin style, named after a site in Switzerland, used spirals, curves, tendrils, trumpet shapes, and interlacing forms that seem almost to breathe across metal and stone. Shields, torques, brooches, swords, and cauldrons could all become canvases for flowing design. Unlike the symmetry of some classical art, Celtic ornament often feels restless and organic, as if lines were growing rather than being drawn. Scholars still debate how much of this style was symbolic and how much was simply aesthetic preference, but the effect is unmistakable. A bronze surface catches the light, and the pattern shifts as the viewer moves, revealing a world of craft where beauty and function were never far apart. Even in battle gear, the Celts could make practical things into works of quiet artistry, carrying pattern and identity into the most everyday materials. The Celtic languages themselves formed a large and varied family, and one of the most interesting details is how widely they spread while still preserving local differences. In ancient times, Celtic speech was heard across much of Western and Central Europe, from the Atlantic edges to the Danubian world, and later it endured in island and mountain regions long after Roman power had changed the continent. Some languages, like Gaulish, are known mainly from inscriptions and names preserved by Roman writers. Others, such as Irish, Welsh, Breton, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx, survived into later historical periods and eventually into the modern world. Linguists can trace shared roots, sound changes, and old grammatical patterns that reveal ancient connections between communities separated by sea or distance. Yet the picture is not fixed or simple. Language was always moving, borrowing, and adapting, shaped by migration, trade, marriage, conquest, and memory. The sound of a word spoken in one valley might have differed subtly from its cousin in another, as if the language itself were a landscape with many bends and streams. Among the most enduring treasures of Celtic heritage are the illuminated manuscripts of the early medieval period, especially those produced in Ireland and Britain after the spread of Christianity. Works such as the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels are not strictly pagan Celtic artifacts, yet they grew from a cultural world shaped by older artistic habits, local craftsmanship, and a love of intricate pattern. Their pages shimmer with interlace, knotwork, knotty beasts, coloured initials, and tiny painted details that invite the eye to linger. In a dim monastery room, where parchment rested on a desk and lamp smoke drifted upward, a scribe could spend hours forming a single page. These books were devotional objects, but they were also achievements of discipline and patience. They show how artistic traditions can survive change by entering new forms, carrying older visual habits into a different religious age. The result is something both familiar and strange, a slow, glowing union of text and ornament. Celtic society also preserved a strong place for skilled metalworkers, whose craft was essential not only to warfare, but to ceremony, status, and exchange. Iron smelting, bronze casting, and the shaping of precious metals all required technical knowledge passed through hands as much as words. A workshop would have smelled of charcoal, heated metal, damp clay molds, and smoke. Hammering could be heard from a distance, a steady rhythm in the background of a settlement. The objects made there were often both beautiful and practical. Cauldrons could serve feasts and ritual gatherings. Fibulae held cloaks in place. Talks around the neck signalled rank, allegiance, or perhaps personal style. Some pieces were richly decorated with coral, enamel, glass, or repoussé work, showing a high level of refinement. Archaeologists continue to uncover unfinished items, broken molds, and workshop debris, which help reveal a world where artisans were not obscure labourers, but important contributors to social identity and prestige. War, of course, is one of the aspects most often associated with the Celts, but even here the story is more textured than the old stereotypes suggest. Ancient writers loved to describe Celtic warriors as fierce, loud, and dramatic, yet the surviving evidence points to a broad range of military practices. Some communities fought in raiding bands. Others maintained fortified settlements, alliances, and forms of organized defense. Armor varied across regions and periods, from simple shields and spears to chainmail and helmets in later centuries. The famous chariot warfare described by Roman observers appears in certain contexts, though not everywhere and not always in the same way. Much of what survives is fragmentary, and Roman accounts often magnify danger to highlight their own victories. Still, weapons placed in grave, repaired swords, and burnished shield bosses all suggest that martial identity carried real significance. For many people, war was not constant life, but one dimension of honor, protection, and community memory, woven into broader patterns of survival. At the same time, trade connected Celtic groups to distant lands in surprisingly delicate ways. Amber from the Baltic, Mediterranean wine, fine glass, coral, and coinage all moved through networks that linked local chiefs and merchants to far-off economies. A burial mound in one region may contain a vessel from another, a brooch style may echo a foreign design, or a coin hoard may reveal contact with multiple political worlds. Rivers, coastlines, and mountain passes served as routes of exchange, and the movement of goods carried stories, techniques, and fashions with it. A cup used at a feast might have travelled farther than the person who owned it. Wine amphorae found in Celtic settlements remind us that feasting was not merely a private event, but a social performance, one where imported goods could express alliance, taste, and status. In this way, the Celts were not isolated tribes standing apart from history. They were participants in a wide web of relationships, their local traditions constantly meeting new influences at the edges of roads and harbours. The women of Celtic societies also played roles that are often overlooked in older summaries. Because written sources are uneven and sometimes biased, it is difficult to describe every region in the same way. But archaeology and later historical references together suggest that women could hold property, participate in ritual life, and occupy positions of considerable influence in some communities. There are powerful figures preserved in later stories and Roman accounts, though these must be treated carefully, since they were often shaped by political purpose or legend. Still, burial evidence can reveal women buried with objects of prestige, ornaments, and symbols of rank. The care taken in arranging hairpins, beads, brooches, and vessels suggests identities that were social, familial, and perhaps ceremonial. In domestic life, women likely played major roles in food production, textile work, and household management, all of which were essential to the functioning of settlements. The broader truth is that Celtic societies, like all ancient societies, depended on many forms of labor and authority, visible and invisible, public and private. As centuries passed, the ancient Celtic world did not vanish in a single moment. It changed slowly, unevenly, and in some places it lingered under new names and new rulers. Roman conquest altered many regions of Gaul, Britain, and Iberia, but local languages, customs, and place names often remained. Later, Christianity reshaped belief and practice, yet it also absorbed and transformed elements of older culture. In the medieval period, Celtic identities persisted in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, and Brittany, where language and law continue to evolve in relation to neighbouring powers. What survives today is not a frozen relic, but a living inheritance made of continuity and adaptation. The word Celtic itself has been used in different ways over time, sometimes by scholars, sometimes by national movements, sometimes by popular imagination. That shifting usage can be confusing, but it also reflects a real historical depth. The ancient Celts belong to a broad and changing story, one carried forward through speech, craft, memory, and the patient work of survival. And finally, perhaps one of the most comforting facts about the Celts is how much of their world still rests in quiet fragments, waiting to be understood. A bronze pin.